As I've written before and publicly stated in interviews, the vast majority of people, when looking at Washington, D.C. and at the Vatican, they never comprehend how those cities constitute one of the greatest open conspiracies of all time. There, reproduced in all of their glory and right before the world's eyes, is an ancient talisman diagram. It's based on the history and cult of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, including the magical utilities meant to generate the deity's return. The primeval concept, especially that of sacred domes facing obelisks, this is something that was designed in antiquity for the express purpose of regeneration, resurrection, and apotheosis, for deity incarnation from the underworld to the earth's surface through union of respective figures. The dome, the ancient structural representation of the womb of Isis, and the obelisk, the ancient representation of the erect male phallus of Osiris. That layout, as modeled in antiquity, exists today on the grandest scale at the heart of the capital of the most important government, most powerful government on earth, the United States, as well as in the heart of the most politically influential church on earth, the Vatican. Now, given this fact and the pattern provided by the Apostle Paul and the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, that the end times would culminate in a marriage between political, that is Antichrist, and religious, that is false prophet, authorities at the return of Osiris Apollo, it really does behoove open-minded researchers to carefully consider these prophecies in stone, as it defines the spiritual energy that's knowingly or unknowingly being invoked at both locations with potential ramifications for the year 2025 and beyond. The U.S. Capitol has been called the Mirror Vatican due to the strikingly similar layout and design of its primary buildings and streets. Now, that's no accident. In fact, America's forefathers first named the capital city Rome. But the parallelism between Washington and the Vatican is most clearly illustrated by the Capitol building and dome facing the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and at St. Peter's Square Basilica in the Vatican by a similar dome facing a familiar obelisk, both of which were, according to their own official records, fashioned after the Roman Pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods. Now, this layout, a domed temple facing an obelisk, is an ancient alchemical blueprint that holds significant esoteric meaning. For those who may not know, the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is historically based on a pagan Masonic temple theme. Thomas Jefferson, who shepherded the anti-Christian Roman Pantheon design, wrote to the Capitol's architect Benjamin Latrobe, defining it as, quote, the first temple dedicated to embellishing with Athenian taste the course of a nation looking far beyond the range of Athenian destinies, end quote. The Athenian Empire was, of course, first known as Osiria, the kingdom of Osiris. In 1833, Massachusetts Representative Rufus Coyote agreed, writing, quote, we have built no national temples but the Capitol, end quote. Now, to understand what these statements may soon mean for the future of the world, one needs to comprehend how these apparati, the dome and the obelisk facing it, facilitate important archaic and modern protocols for invigorating prophetic supernatural alchemy. In ancient times, the obelisk represented the god Osiris's missing male organ, which Isis was not able to find after her husband brother was slain and chopped into 14 pieces by his evil brother Set. The story involves a detailed account of the envious brother and 72, that's an important number, conspirators tricking Osiris into climbing inside of a box, which Set quickly locked and threw into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and his body floated down the Nile River where it snagged on the limbs of a tamarisk tree. In Byblos, Isis recovered his body from the riverbank and took it into her care, but in her absence, Seth stole the body again, and this time chopped it into 14 pieces, which he threw back into the Nile. Isis searched the riverbank until she recovered every piece except for the genitals, which had been swallowed by a fish. Isis recombined the 13 pieces of Osiris' corpse and replaced the missing organ with a magic facsimile, an obelisk, which she used to impregnate herself during the very first raising of Osiris ceremony, in which she called forth the seed of the dead god from the underworld up through the magic device, thus giving rise to Osiris again in the person of his son, Horus. Now, this legendary ritual for reincarnating Osiris formed the core of Egyptian cosmology, as well as the Rosicrucian Masonic dying and rising myths, and was fantastically venerated on the most imposing scale throughout all of Egypt by towering obelisks representing the phallus of Osiris and domes representing the pregnant belly of Isis, including at Karnak, where the upright obelisks were vitalized or stimulated from the energy of the masturbatory sun god Ra shining down upon them. In Egypt, where rituals were performed to actually raise the spirit of Osiris into the reigning pharaoh, political authority in the form of divine kingship or theocratic statesmanship was established, later reflected in the political and religious doctrine of royal and political legitimacy, or the divine right of kings, who supposedly derived their right to rule from the will of God, with the exception, in some countries, that the king is subject to the church and to the pope. But this meant, among other things, that the Egyptian pharaoh enjoyed extraordinary authority as the son of the sun god Ra and the incarnation of the falcon god Horus during his lifetime. At death, Pharaoh would become the Osiris, the divine judge of the netherworld, and on earth his son and predecessor would take his place as the newly anointed manifestation of Horus. So each generation of pharaohs provided the gods with a spokesman for the present world and for the afterlife, while also offering the nation divinely appointed leadership. And yet the observant listener may wonder, was there something more to the pharaoh's deification than faith in ritual magic? Well, the cult center of Amun-Ra at Thebes may actually hold the answer, as it was the site of the largest religious structure ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and the location of many extraordinary, mysterious rites. The great temple, with its miles of walls and gardens, the primary object by the way of fascination and worship by the nemesis of Moses, the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses II, was the place where each pharaoh reconciled his divinity in the company of Amun-Ra during the festival of Opet. Now, the festival was held at the Temple of Luxor, and it included a procession of gods carried on barges up the Nile River from Karnak to the temple. The royal family would accompany the gods on boats, while the Egyptian laity would walk along the shore, calling out and making requests of the gods. But once at Luxor, the pharaoh and his entourage would enter the Holy of Holies, the Temple of Isis, the domed belly, where the ceremony to raise the spirit of Osiris into the king would be performed, the raising of Osiris ceremony, by the magicians of Egypt. And don't forget, these men were very powerful, as they were able to mimic almost all of the miracles conducted by God through the hand of Moses during the Exodus. But in any case, it was truly believed that Pharaoh at that moment would be transmogrified into a living deity, Osiris in flesh. Outside, large groups of dancers and musicians would wait anxiously, and then when the king emerged as the born-again Osiris, the crowd would erupt in gaiety. And from that day forward, the pharaoh would be considered to be, just as the god ciphered on the Great Seal of the United States will be, the son and spiritual incarnation of the supreme deity, the all-seeing eye, of Horus, Apollo, Osiris above the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal represents that event. Now fast forward to today, and at the inauguration of every American president, across town at the House of the Temple, the modern Egyptian magicians, the Freemasons, Scottish Rite, 33rd degree, are conducting the raising of Osiris ceremony to call the seat of Osiris Apollo from the underworld through the Washington Monument obelisk, where it magically emits into the U.S. Capitol dome, while America's new leader is standing there accepting his role as the living representative of Osiris. This is done in anticipation of the day when events are going to surpass parity, and the beast that was and is not shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, the Greek word Apollo. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. Revelation 17:8. For a few adepts of history and secret orders, this DC ritual is deliciously staged, as even the term inaugurate is from the Latin inauguratio, and it refers to the archaic ceremony by which the Roman augurs or soothsayers would approve a king or a ruler through omens as being sanctioned by the god Jupiter, the same entities whose prophecies on the Great Seal herald his upcoming challenge to Yahweh Jehovah for heavenly supremacy, while his son Apollo Osiris seizes authority over the world in a final pagan golden age. As pointed out in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025, the dome where U.S. presidents stand during their inauguration and where they lie in state for their spirit to rise into the apotheosis overhead to join George Washington in the kingdom of Osiris at death alone is an unparalleled magical construct that openly hides the most formidable ancient supernaturalism meant for regeneration of Apollo Osiris. In fact, I would go so far as to say it is a satanic antichrist plagiarism of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that I believe is going to play a role in the healing of Antichrist after he experiences a deadly head wound in Revelation 13:3. Note that the 1865 apotheosis of Washington, painted by Greek-Italian artist Costantino Brumidi, is visible through the oculus of the dome in the rotunda, and it bears anything but Christian symbols. It's filled with Greco-Roman gods to whom Thomas Jefferson dedicated the United States. The very term apotheosis means to become a god, or revived eternal being. Now, in this depiction, Washington is becoming Osiris of the afterlife. The gods in the painting surrounding Washington are depicting helping the founders establish a more perfect union, as in the New Atlantis scheme that I go into the details of in Zeitgeist 2025. Directly beneath the apotheosis are 72 pentagrams, forming a sorcerous gateway used by secret society members and occultists to bind and loose the 72 fallen angels that reside over the heathen nations. You can learn more about that in Psalms 82, Deuteronomy 32, and so on. Finally, under the floor of the rotunda is the U.S. National Crypt, where an empty tomb resides. He is not here, for he is risen. This is where I argue that Antichrist will be taken after his head injury, and the Freemasons will conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony, at which time he will be transmogrified into the living incarnation of Osiris Apollo. Now, there is more to the Capitol Dome, Antichrist plagiarism of the life of Christ, that I go into in Zeitgeist 2025 than these aspects of the building's design might infer. But these points of interest clearly reveal how the architects imagined a dark parody of Jesus. How so? Well, as Jesus died and rose into heaven, so Washington rises to become the Osiris in the top of the U.S. Capitol Dome. As the 72 pentagrams in the Capitol Dome are used to control the 72 cosmocrators over the nation, Jesus too confronted the 72 fallen watchers, from the base of Mount Hermon to his visit in the underworld and final ascension into heaven, whereby he proclaimed in Revelation 1:18, "I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore," which is a clear denunciation of the Osiris dying and rising god myth that was so popular during his first advent. He goes on, "Amen, and have the keys of hell." This is the word Hades, the names that the Greeks gave to Osiris, and of death, end quote. It's important because Osiris was the lord of the underworld in Greek myth who possessed the keys to the 12 gates of Egyptian afterlife. Much has been written by historians within and without Masonry as to the relevance of the number 72 and the alchemy related to it. For instance, in Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and Jewish apocalyptic writings, the number 72 equals the total of wings that Enoch received when he's transformed into the powerful angel Metatron. You could see 3 Enoch 9:2 for more on that. And this plays an important role for the Brotherhood, as Metatron was also known as the angel in the whirlwind, who was enabled as the guiding spirit over America during George W. Bush's administration for the purpose of directing the future and fate of the United States, as was also prayed by Congressman Major R. Owens of New York before the House of Representatives on Wednesday, February 28, 2001. But in the context of the Capitol Dome and the 72 stars that circle Washington's apotheosis in the womb of Isis, the significance of this symbolism is far more important. In sacred literature, including the Bible, stars are symbolic of angels, and within Masonic Gnosticism, these 72 powerful entities, reflected in the 72 conspirators that controlled Osiris's life in Egyptian myth, currently administer the affairs of earth under Satan, the god of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 4:4. Experts in the study of the divine council believe that, beginning at the Tower of Babel, the world and its inhabitants were disinherited by the sovereign God of Israel and placed under the authority of 72 angels. These angels became corrupt and disloyal to God in their administration of those nations, according to Psalms 82. These beings quickly became worshipped on earth as gods following Babel, led by Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo. Consistent within this tradition, the designers of the Capitol Dome, the Great Seal of the United States, and the Obelisk Washington Monument circled the apotheosis of Washington with 72 pentagram stars. They dedicated the obelisk 72 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and they placed 72 stones on the Great Seal's uncapped pyramid, above which the prophetic eye of Horus, Osiris, Apollo stares. These 3 sets of 72, combined with the imagery and occult numerology of the Osiris obelisk, the Isis dome, and the oracular Great Seal, are richly symbolic of the influence of Satan and his angels over the world, according to Luke 4, 2 Corinthians 4, Ephesians 6, and other scripture, with a prophecy towards Satan's final earthly empire, the coming Novus Ordo Seclorum, or new pagan golden age. Now, in order for the inevitable worship of Osiris to be reestablished on earth, the 72 demons that govern the nations have to be controlled. Therefore, they are set in magical constraints on the Great Seal, the Washington obelisk, and the pentagram circles around the apotheosis of Washington in order to bind and force the desired effect. In The Secret Destiny of America, famous Freemason Manly P. Hall noted as well that the 72 stones on the pyramid on the Great Seal correspond to the 72 arrangements of the Tetragrammaton, or the 4-lettered name of God in Hebrew. He wrote this: "These 4 letters can be combined in 72 combinations, resulting in what is called the Shemhamphorash, which represents in turn the laws, powers, and energies of nature," end quote. Now, folks, the idea that the mystical name of God could be invoked to bind or release those supernatural agents, or powers and energies of nature, as Hall called them, is meaningful creed within many occult tenets, including Kabbalah and Freemasonry. This is why the 72 stars are pentagram-shaped around the deified Freemason George Washington. Medieval books of magic, or grimoires such as the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, not only identify the star systems Orion, or Osiris, and Pleiades, Apollo, as the home of these powers, but applies great importance to the pentagram shape of the stars for binding and releasing their influence. Adept Rosicrucians and Freemasons have long used these magical texts, the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, to do just that. Modern people, especially in America, may view all of these symbols used in this magic, especially the dome representing the habitually pregnant belly of Isis, and the obelisk representing the erect phallus of Osiris, as profane or pornographic. But they were in fact ritualized fertility objects, which the ancients believed could produce tangible reactions, properties, or manifestations within the material world. The obelisk and dome, as imitations of the deity's male and female reproductive organs, could, through government representation, invoke into existence the being or beings symbolized by them. And that is why inside the temple or dome, prostitutes representing the human manifestation of the goddess were also available for ritual sex as a form of imitative magic. Through such imitative sex, the dome and obelisk became energy receivers, capable of assimilating Ra's essence from the rays of the sun, which in turn would draw forth the seed of the underworld Osiris. The seed of the dead entity would, according to the supernaturalism, transmit upward from out of the underworld through the base or testes of the obelisk and magically emit from the tower's head into the womb or dome of Isis, where incarnation into the sitting pharaoh, king, or president would occur during what Freemasons also call the raising of Osiris ceremony. In this way, Osiris could be habitually born again or reincarnated as Horus and constantly direct the spiritual destiny of the nation. Something most people do not know and will be shocked to learn in my new book is that the Freemasons even constructed a symbolic seed of Osiris at the Washington Monument obelisk. If an anatomically correct phallus is placed over the Washington Monument, right in the testicular section beneath a manhole cover, where it should be, is a miniature 12-foot tall obelisk hidden just beneath the surface of the ground, representing the seat of Osiris. The number 12, of course, is the biblical and occult numerology for perfect government. In this case, that new world order over which Osiris Apollo is going to reign, when the beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, rises at the end of time to oversee the dawn of a new golden age. This metaphysical phenomenon of deity resurrection involving mystical seed reminds of the messianic proto-evangelium promise, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel, Genesis 3:15, which for occultists was countered by Nimrod Semiramis and was central to numerous other ancient cultures, especially developed in Egypt, where Nimrod Semiramis were known as Osiris and Isis. And in Ezekiel chapter 8, the children of Israel set up the obelisk or image of jealousy. You can see that in verse 5, facing the entry of their temple, just as the dome faces the obelisk in Washington, D.C., and in the Vatican City, and were condemned by God for worshiping the sun, or Ra, while weeping for Osiris or Tammuz. The familiar Masonic figure of the point within a circle, is the symbol of this union between Ra, Osiris, and Isis. The point represents Osiris's phallus in the center of the circle or womb of Isis, which in turn is enlivened by the sun rays of Ra, just as today at the Vatican, where the Egyptian obelisk of Osiris sits within a circle, and in Washington, D.C., where the obelisk does similarly, situated so as to be the first thing that the sun, or Ra, strikes as it rises over the capital city, and which, when viewed from overhead, forms this magical point within a circle known as a circumpunct. The sorcery is further amplified, according to ancient occultic beliefs, by the presence of the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C., which serves as a mirror to heaven and a transferring point for those spirits and energies. And just what is it that the spirits see when they look downward on the reflecting pool in Washington? They find a city dedicated to and built in honor of the legendary deities Isis and Osiris, complete with the 13 gathered pieces of Osiris, America's original 13 colonies, the required obelisk known as the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome of Isis for impregnation and incarnation of deity into each pharaoh or president, and last but not least, the official government buildings erected to face their respective counterparts and whose cornerstones, including the U.S. Capitol Dome, were dedicated during astrological alignment related to the zodiacal constellation Virgo or Isis, as required for the magic to occur. The information that I just shared with you is only the tip of the iceberg of what I reveal in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025. In fact, much of what I uncover in this book is too hot for mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and would immediately be censored. But now, for the first time ever, you are going to discover hidden secrets and forgotten prophecies surrounding the year 2025, how the current U.S. government is tied to America's occult destiny, lost prophecies from Qumran forecasting 2025 as the final age of man, why historians and intelligence agencies foresee a totalitarian world government by 2025, how America's capital city is laid out to actuate the arrival of the Antichrist, about the malevolent Orwellian Trinity currently converging, the means by which the population's thinking and speaking are being homogenized to create a nation of assimilated devotees who are going to embrace the Antichrist, the deep esoteric meanings that names and titles held in ancient societies, the impact they had upon destiny, and what that precedent could mean now for America's near future. Who the mysterious character Melchizedek of Genesis 14 truly was, what the people of the name covenant is, and much more. So go to sidroth.org/horn or click the link below to get your digital copy of my revelatory new book, Zeitgeist 2025, so you can count yourself among the ones prepared for what is coming next. Before and after the presidency of Donald Trump, the United States was, and now it is again, on what I would call an intentional trajectory to fulfill what famous Freemason Manly P. Hall described as the secret destiny of America, which includes a future national and global subservience to the god of Freemasonry, a deity that most Americans would not imagine when reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to one nation under God. In fact, the idea by some that the United States was established as a monotheistic Christian nation by those who designed Washington, D.C., and that the God referred to on American currency as a Judeo-Christian one, it's really a puzzling conclusion when reflected against the deistic beliefs of so many of the founding fathers as you can see, perpetually viewed in the so-called supreme architect deism of Freemasons, and in the supreme judge of the world and the divine providence notations that are in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, as well as the countless pagan icons that actually dominate the symbols, the statues, the buildings, the seals that were carefully drafted under official government auspices. The Great Seal of the United States primary among them, which Manly P. Hall, the famous Freemason, rightly called the signature of that exalted body of Masons who designed America for what he called a peculiar and particular purpose. It all bears rich symbolism, forecasting anything but Christianity. As a matter of fact, when Christians in the 1800s argued that a hypothetical annihilation of the United States would lead to antiquaries of succeeding centuries, and by that they meant historians, concluding that America had been a heathen nation based on the symbolism of the Great Seal, Congress was pushed to create something reflecting the Christian faith of so many of its citizens. U.S. President and Freemason Theodore Roosevelt, he strongly opposed this idea, but other Masons weren't as frustrated with the plan because, given the ambivalence of the term God, and the axiom that, interpreted within the context of the Great Seal's symbolism, this certainly would not infer the biblical Christian God. Therefore, the slogan, "In God We Trust," whoever you believe that God is, was accommodated by Masons and other Illuminatus, who therefore approved as the official U.S. motto the phrase, "In God We Trust." In my book, Zenith 2016, which among other things noted that the year of Donald Trump's presidential election had been foreseen by prophets and sages for thousands of years as the apex date, when governments would begin shifting toward the spirit that is predicted on the Great Seal of the United States, the Antichrist, followed by the actual man of sin's arrival and acceptance on the global stage in the year 2025, which people will discover in the new book, Zeitgeist 2025. But this was to illustrate the point in my book, Zenith 2016, that one definitely would not determine that the God in America's official motto refers to the Father of Jesus or a biblical Trinity. I wrote in that book, quote, "Imagine yourself as a space traveler who visits Earth in a fictional post-apocalyptic world. Digging through the rubble of the once thriving planet, you come across a copy of a U.S. $1 bill with the two-sided Great Seal of the United States joined in the middle by the phrase, 'In God We Trust.' Upon consideration, you ask yourself, what God did this refer to? And with no preconceptions, you allow the symbolism on the seal to speak for itself, from which you quickly determine that this had been a great culture who worshipped Egyptian and Greek deities, especially a particular solar one whose all-seeing eye glares from atop an unfinished Egyptian pyramid. Upon further investigation into the specific beliefs of the strange group whose members had influenced the Great Seal, you discover from their highest masters, including one illustrious Albert Pike, that the sun god they venerated so highly had been known to them at various times in history by the names Apollo, Osiris, and Nimrod, end quote. Now, I made that argument in Zenith 2016 because, unknown to most Americans, and certainly to the average Christian, the Great Seal's mottos and symbolism relate to both Osiris and Apollo specifically, and yet as one. Osiris is the dominant theme of the Egyptian symbols, his resurrection and return, while the mottos of the seal point directly to Apollo, and the eagle, a pagan emblem of Jupiter, to Apollo's father. For instance, the motto Anahuac Coeptus This is from Virgil's Aeneid, in which Ascanius, the son of Aeneas from conquered Troy, prays to Apollo's father, Jupiter or Zeus. Charles Thomson, the designer of the Great Seal's final version, condensed line 625 of Book 9 of Virgil's Aeneid, which reads, Jupiter omnipotus, audacibus annuet coeptus, which means all-powerful Jupiter favors the daring undertaking. He condensed that down to annuet coeptus. He approves our undertaking. While the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, was adapted in 1782 from inspiration that Thomson found in a prophetic line in Virgil's Eclogue 4, which reads Magnus ab integro seclorum nascitur ordo, from Virgil's Eclogue 4, line 5, the interpretation of the original Latin being, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Now that phrase is from the Cumae Sibyl, a pagan prophetess of Apollo identified in the Bible as a demonic deceiver, and it involves the future birth of a divine son spawned from a new breed of men sent down from heaven when he receives the life of gods and sees heroes with gods commingling. According to this prophecy, this is Apollo, the son of Jupiter, or Zeus, who returns to Earth through mystical life given to him from the gods when the deity Saturn, or Jupiter, returns to reign over the cosmos in a new pagan golden age, what the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn on December 21, 2020 forecast, which many, by the way, including pastors, were erroneously referring to as the Christmas star. According to the Greek texts, the Magi followed an asteroid, not a stationary star alignment, whose trajectory led them to Bethlehem. But it was the closest that these two planets have appeared together in approximately 800 years not long ago, and it did indeed forecast the arrival of a messianic son, the false one, whose spirit will reside in the beast of Revelation 17:8. From the beginning of the prophecy, referenced on the Great Seal of the United States, here's what we read. Now the last age, by Cumae Sibyl sung, has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou at the boy's birth, in whom the iron shall cease, the golden race arise. Befriend him, chaste Lucina, 'tis thine own Apollo reigns. He shall receive the life of gods and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, and with his father's worth reign over the world. Assume thy greatness, for the time draws nigh, dear child of gods, great progeny of Jove, or Jupiter Zeus. See how it totters, the world's orbed might, earth and wide ocean, and the vault profound, all see enraptured of the coming time. End quote. According to Virgil and the Cumae Sibyl, whose prophecy formed the Novus Ordo Seclorum on the Great Seal of the United States, the New World Order begins during a time of chaos, when the earth and the oceans are tottering, a time like today. This is when the Son of Promise will suddenly arrive on earth, Apollo incarnate, a pagan savior, born of a new breed of men sent down from heaven when heroes and gods are blended together. It sounds eerily similar to what the Watchers did during the creation of Genesis 6 giants, doesn't it? And why many believe that Antichrist also represents the return of the Nephilim. But to understand why such a fanciful prophecy about Apollo, son of Jupiter, returning to Earth should be important to you, in ancient literature, Jupiter was the Roman replacement of Yahweh. As the greatest of the gods, he was a counter-Yahweh. His son Apollo is a replacement of Jesus, a counter-Jesus And this Apollo comes to rule the final New World Order when justice returns old Saturn's reign. Now this ancient goddess Justice, who returns Saturn's reign, Saturnia Regna, the pagan Golden Age, was known to the Egyptians as Mat and to the Greeks as Demas, while to the Romans she was Lustitia. Now statues and reliefs of her adorn thousands of government buildings and courts around the world, but especially in Washington, D.C., where she stands as familiar Lady Justice, blindfolded and holding scales and a sword. She represents, according to the prophecy, the enforcement of secular law, and is, according to this Sibyl's conjure, the authority that's going to require global compliance to the zenith of Satan's dominion, concurrent with the coming of Apollo. What's more, the Bible's accuracy concerning this subject is alarming, including the idea that pagan justice will require surrender to a satanic system in a final world order under the rule of Jupiter's son. In the New Testament, the identity of the god Apollo, coded in the Great Seal of the United States as the Masonic Messiah who's going to return to rule the earth, is the same spirit, verified by the same name that will inhabit the political leader of the end times New World Order. For instance, according to key Bible prophecies, the Antichrist will be the progeny or the incarnation of the ancient spirit of Apollo. 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." And this is the Greek word apoleia, Apollo. Revelation 17:8 likewise ties the coming of Antichrist with Apollo, revealing that the beast shall ascend from the bottomless pit and enter into him. It says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition," apoleia, Apollo. "And they that dwell on earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is." End quote. Among other things, this means that the Great Seal of the United States is a prophecy, hidden in plain sight by the Founding Fathers for more than 200 years, foretelling the return of a terrifying demonic god that seizes control of earth in the new order of the ages. This supernatural entity was known and feared in ancient times by different names: Apollo, Osiris, and even farther back as Nimrod, whom Masons consider to be the father of their institution. In the last chapter of the book Zeitgeist 2025, we circle back to that prophecy to expose the most insidious aspect of the scheme that is now counting down to the year 2025. The information that I just shared with you is only the tip of the iceberg of what I reveal in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025. In fact, much of what I uncover in this book is too hot for mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and would immediately be censored. But now, for the first time ever, you are going to discover hidden secrets and forgotten prophecies surrounding the year 2025, how the current U.S. government is tied to America's occult destiny, lost prophecies from Qumran forecasting 2025 as the final age of man, why historians and intelligence agencies foresee a totalitarian world government by 2025, how America's capital city is laid out to actuate the arrival of the Antichrist, about the malevolent Orwellian Trinity currently converging, the means by which the population's thinking and speaking are being homogenized to create a nation of assimilated devotees who are going to embrace the Antichrist, the deep esoteric meanings that names and titles held in ancient societies the impact they had upon destiny, and what that precedent could mean now for America's near future. Who the mysterious character Melchizedek of Genesis 14 truly was, what the people of the name covenant is, and much more. When U.S. Representative Nancy Pelosi on January 4, 2007, assumed her role as Speaker of the House at the opening of the 110th Congress, she followed the pattern that had been set by George W. Bush and his old man, infusing a loaded statement concerning the Founding Fathers, saying they were so confident in the, quote, America that they were advancing, they put on the Great Seal of the United States, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the centuries, end quote. Pelosi did not go into detail as to why she considered the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum important dialectic during the momentous changeover of the control of Congress, nor did she add why that expression exists beneath the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye of Horus Osiris Apollo on the Great Seal of the United States in the first place. But her allusion to it was not coincidental. I believe it was framed against January 20, 2001, when her dynastic establishment president friend George W. Bush, during his first inaugural address, faced the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and twice referred to an angel that rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm, end quote. Now, his statement was credited to Virginia statesman John Page, who had written to Thomas Jefferson after the Declaration of Independence was signed, saying, "We know the race is not to the swift nor the battle to the strong. Do you not think that an angel rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm?" End quote. Now, 5 weeks after Bush's inaugural, on Wednesday, February 28, 2001, Congressman Major R. Owens of New York stood before the House of Representatives, and he actually prayed to this angel in the whirlwind. He asked the spiritual force to guide the future and the fate of the United States. 28 weeks later, for a total of 33 weeks from the day of the inaugural, a number invaluable to mysticism and occult fraternities, 19 Islamic terrorists attacked the United States, according to the official story, hijacking 4 commercial airlines and crashing 2 of them into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. They slammed a 3rd into the Pentagon, and a 4th, which had been directed towards Washington, D.C., crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But what happened that day resulted in nearly 3,000 immediate deaths, at least 24 missing persons, and the stage being set for changes to the existing world order. Now, when Bush was giving his second inaugural speech 4 years later, he again offered cryptic commentary, saying, quote, "For a half-century, America defended our freedom by standing watch on distant borders. After the shipwreck of communism came years of relative quiet, years of repose, years of sabbatical. And then there came a day of fire." End quote. A few paragraphs following that, Bush added this, "By our efforts, we have lit a fire as well, a fire in the minds of men. It warms those who feel its power. It burns those who fight its progress. And one day, this untamed fire of freedom will reach the darkest corners of our world." End quote. Now, this phrase, "a fire in the minds of men," is from Fyodor Dostoevsky's 19th century book, The Possessed, or The Devils, a novel set in pre-revolutionary Russia, where civil resistance is seen championed by nihilist Sergei Negev, who tries to ignite a revolution of such destructive power that society will be completely destroyed and then rebuilt. The fact that a United States president would quote this phrase in an official speech of record was astonishing to many analysts, given that The Possessed is about violent government crackdown on dissent. that sparks civil unrest and revolution marked by public violence, something eerily reminiscent of today. Fire in the Minds of Men is also the title that historian James H. Billington chose for his famous book on the history of revolutions, including the origin of occult Freemasonry and its part in the American Revolution. In his closing comments, Bush himself tied the inaugural crypticisms to the Masonic involvement in the American Revolution, saying this, quote, "When our founders declared a new order of the ages, they were acting on an ancient hope that is meant to be fulfilled," end quote. The phrase, "a new order of the ages," is of course taken from the Masonically designed Great Seal, the Novus Ordo Seclorum. And Bush further acknowledged that the secret society members were acting on an ancient hope, an ancient scheme that is meant to be fulfilled. Now fast forward to the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and the surreal, illicit invocation to dark supernaturalism tied to those governing entities intent on fulfilling, as Bush prophesied, that ancient conspiracy from the Great Seal of the United States has been immediately revived, right on cue. We find Democrat Representative Emanuel Cleaver, for instance, offering the congressional prayer, opening up the 117th Congress in, quote, "the name of the monotheistic god Brahma, and God known by many names by many different faiths," end quote. Now, setting aside the numerous incorrect assumptions by Cleaver involving Brahma, the entreaty to such a Hindu god was actually highly appropriate, given that Vice President Kamala Devi Harris, her name also invokes deities from Hindu mythology, from which Brahma is taken, but except in her case, illusionary and destructive ones. From the surprising meaning of Kamala Harris's name at thelist.com, we discover that Kamala is another name of the well-known Hindu goddess who is probably better known as Lakshmi. Devi is a Hindu goddess as well. It's a Sanskrit word that means goddess, but it's also the name of the Hindu mother goddess. Devi is considered to encompass womanhood completely, but she does have a fierce side and is involved not only creating worlds, but destroying them as well. Kamala Harris's sister's middle name matches hers, Maya. Her middle name is Lakshmi. Maya is also a Sanskrit name meaning illusion, and is another name of Durga, a Hindu goddess. Now the list goes on to explain that Kamala's mother, Shamala, chose those names specifically because, quote, "a culture that worships goddesses produces strong women," end quote. That's what she told the Los Angeles Times. Perhaps this explains why those strong women and men have taken to the streets of Portland, Oregon over the last 2 years to feed the spirit of chaos beneath the shadow of Portlandia, the second largest copper statue after the Statue of Liberty of a goddess in the United States. At 30 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 6.5 tons, if she was standing up, she would tower at approximately 50 feet high. The Portlandia repose is located above the entrance of the City of Portland office buildings downtown, and it's implicative, actually, of the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate. Supposedly designed after Lady Commerce on the Portland City Seal, she holds a trident, considered of the utmost importance for sorcery and indispensable to the efficacy of infernal rites. She holds that under a 6-pointed star, which is, of course, also an important instrument of dark arts and Hecatean witchcraft. Now, as occultists know, the metal, copper, that Portlandia is crafted from was sacred to ancient goddess worshippers. In early Rome, copper was called cyprium, due to being primarily mined from Cyprus, the birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite. It was also sacred to the sun god of Babylon and similar deities, some of whom required human sacrifice. A plaque beneath Portlandia offers disquieting connections between her influence over that city and the souls of those citizens that she reigns over. Here's what it says, quote, "She kneels down And from the quietness of copper reaches out, we take that stillness into ourselves. And somewhere deep in the earth, our breath or souls become her city. If she could speak, this is what she would say. Follow that breath. Home is the journey we make. This is how the world knows where we are. End quote. So the pattern continues between some of America's recent national leaders whose invitations, unlike Donald Trump's habitual recognition of the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible, have been to dark supernaturalism for ruling over and guiding the souls and destiny of this nation into an occult world order. This now includes the new vice president, who could certainly become the actual president if acting Joe Biden, whom former White House stenographer Mike McCormick, who worked for Biden for 6 years, says has lost at least 50% of his cognitive abilities, becomes incapacitated or otherwise incapable of fulfilling his 4-year term, who bears the name of Hindu entities connected with illusion and the destruction of worlds. By the way, Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, upon witnessing the first detonation of the nuclear weapon on July 16, 1945, actually quoted the related Bhagavad Gita Hindu text declaring, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," end quote. Now, Joe Biden's name is likewise intriguing. In fact, a Jewish scholar points out that the Hebraic name for Joe Biden actually translates, alas, judgment, while other experts note that it beckons the arrival of a promised son, a Messiah, such as is reflected on the Great Seal of the United States of America. According to prominent Rabbi R.I. Weingarten, who says Biden's name contains the letters Yud Dalid, this spells out the word Yad, or hand, and he tells us why this is important. There's an article at Israel 365 that explains. Rabbi Weingarten states that the first and last letters of Biden's name spell out the word Ben, meaning son, which hints at the process of Messiah, which will come through Messiah ben David, the anointed son of David, and Messiah ben Joseph, the anointed son of Joseph. Now, Rabbi Weingarten adds that the gematria, the Hebrew numerology of Ben, is 52, equaling the name of Elijah, the prophet who is the harbinger of Messiah. Now here's something else he says. This is not to say that Biden is the Messiah or will announce the Messiah, but this is a reminder that even a path that we would rather not choose, that is, the election of Joe Biden, could be God's method to bring about the final redemption. Now, Rabbi Weingarten then notes the inner letters of the name of Biden, Yud and Dalet, and the gematria of those letters equaling 24. He goes on, quote, "Many times in the Bible, David's name is written with a Yud, bringing the numerical total of his name to 24. Biden's last name is coming to remind us that we are on the verge of Elijah's arrival to reestablish the Davidic dynasty," end quote. Now, the problem is, of course, for Christians and Messianic Jews, the Messiah already arrived in the New Testament. His name is Jesus. Therefore, the prophetic suggestion involving Biden's name most likely indicates a role that he could play with the coming of the false Messiah, the Antichrist. Even some Orthodox rabbis seem to agree with that, connecting the election of Biden and Kamala with the return of the days of Noah. Rabbi Joel Schwartz, the head of the Sanhedrin's Noahide court and a highly respected Torah law authority, produced a video in which he commented on the divergent possibilities of the U.S. presidential election. Here's a quote. "The elections were held on the 17th of Cheshvan." He says that, and then he makes us understand what this has to do with Jewish tradition, the 17th of Cheshvan being the start of the rains that caused the flood in the time of Noah. They begin falling on the 17th of Cheshvan. He goes on, quote, "It was also on that day that here in Israel, the first rains of the season fell in earnest. They should have been rains of blessing, but since Biden was elected, these rains became like the rain on the same day in the time of Noah, a harbinger of the coming flood. Rabbi Schwartz adds, quote, "The Democrats are spreading the very same sins that forced Noah into the ark," end quote, while another rabbi similarly notes that in Hebrew, Haris means destruction. With Trump out of the way, at least for the time being, the dark side of the deep state is quickly reviving efforts to refill the swamp and to get America back on track to its secret destiny, summoning those agents of chaos whose ancient scheme will culminate in arrival of the dreaded man of sin. Now, Joe Biden himself pledged allegiance to this new world order in a Wall Street Journal op-ed titled "How I Learned to Love the New World Order," in which he detailed his vision of surrendering American sovereignty to a new global government via the United Nations. He said, quote, "Most Americans, myself included, reject 1930s-style isolationism. They expect to see the strong hand of American leadership in world affairs, and they know that many security threats require global solutions," end quote. Will Biden's vision quickly unfold in the countdown to Zeitgeist 2025? People who are not governed by God will be ruled by tyrants, said William Penn, the founder of the English North American colony, the province of Pennsylvania. And for all those now bidding the return of old Saturn or Jupiter's reign, we would also remind them of the ancient Greek tragedian Sophocles, whose warning was this: those whom Jupiter wishes to destroy, he first deprives of reason or drives mad. But that said, it appears that left-leaning Americans are nevertheless rushing to embrace the newly appointed zeitgeist gods, and this was actually vividly illustrated on the spring 2021 cover of Jacobin, a leading voice of the American left offering socialist perspectives on politics, economics, and culture, where the apotheosis of Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton with Hillary Clinton are accompanied by lesser Elohim, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, portrayed as angels. Biden's larger-than-life bare-chested figure is shown surrounded by holy spirits of Twitter and saints. The latter include kneeling Democrat leaders in the U.S. Congress, Dr. Anthony Fauci, fawning journalists and manager-class devotees eagerly consuming the Holy Scripture from what is probably the latest Barack Obama memoir. The former president himself is shown as a six-winged seraphim, bracketed by the likewise angelic Obama, Hillary, and Bill Clinton, with the trio gazing benignly from the heavens. A crowd of mask-wearing suburban laymen on earth celebrate Biden's ascension. The information that I just shared with you is only the tip of the iceberg of what I reveal in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025. In fact, much of what I uncover in this book is too hot for mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and would immediately be censored. But now, for the first time ever, you are going to discover hidden secrets and forgotten prophecies surrounding the year 2025, how the current U.S. government is tied to America's occult destiny, lost prophecies from Qumran forecasting 2025 as the final age of man, why historians and intelligence agencies foresee a totalitarian world government by 2025, how America's capital city is laid out to actuate the arrival of the Antichrist, about the malevolent Orwellian trinity currently converging, the means by which the population's thinking and speaking are being homogenized to create a nation of assimilated devotees who are going to embrace the Antichrist, the deep esoteric meanings that names and titles held in ancient societies, the impact they had upon destiny, and what that precedent could mean now for America's near future. Who the mysterious character Melchizedek of Genesis 14 truly was, what the people of the name covenant is, and much more.